Good morning. I want us to start this morning by playing a little game. And the game is called Who Is This? In a few seconds, we're going to put up on the screen 3 images of different people that you might know. The only thing is, the images are blurred. So you have to see if you can work out who they are. Maybe if there's some people around you as you're watching this, you can chat with them to see if you can work out who this is. So here's our first one, the first image. What do you think? Do you think you can work out who this is? Well, let's see if you're right. Let's reveal. It's Peppa Pig, everybody's favorite cartoon pig. Here's the next one. Is this a little bit harder? Maybe you know this one. Maybe you don't. Give you a few seconds to see if you can work out who this one is. Let's reveal. It's Captain Barnacles. Of course it is. Here's our third and final person. Who is this? Maybe a little bit more difficult. What do we think? Okay, let's reveal. Marcus Rashford. Of course it's Marcus Rashford, man of the moment. Who is this? It's a fun game, isn't it? And the funny thing is, Mark is actually playing that sort of game with us this morning. Because you see, this true story that we're learning about Jesus this morning, it's from the first half of Mark's account about Jesus' life. And all the way through the first half of Mark's gospel, Mark is trying to show us who Jesus is. And if we'd been reading from the beginning of Mark's gospel, we would have seen that Mark has already given us a really big hint. Because you see, right in the first verse of the first chapter, Mark says this: the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. Mark is saying this is the beginning of the good news about Jesus, God's King. And everything that Mark has written from that very first verse of his account, right up to chapter 4 and verse 35, where we are this morning, Mark has been showing us this. Now, this morning's passage, as Nick showed us, starts with Jesus teaching. Jesus is teaching on the east side of Lake Galilee. He's been teaching there all day. And as Jesus has been teaching through the day, more and more people have been coming to him. In fact, so many people have come to hear Jesus teaching that Jesus had to get into a boat in the shallow water so he could teach all the people on the shore. And then when we come to verse 35, the beginning of our passage this morning, we see that now evening is drawing in. And as evening draws in, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." And so leaving the crowd behind, Jesus and his disciples took Jesus along just as he was in the boat, and there were also other boats with him. As evening draws in, Jesus says to his disciples, "Let's go over to the other side." And so the disciples, with Jesus and some other boats around him, set off on the 7-mile journey across the Sea of Galilee. Now, it's important for us to realize that this wouldn't have been a scary journey for the disciples. Now, you may know that at least 4 of the disciples, maybe more, were professional fishermen before they started following Jesus. They would have made this journey from the east to the west side of Lake Galilee many times before. And so as they set off with Jesus in the boat, they would have been confident that this would be an ordinary sea journey. But no matter how many times the disciples may have made that 7-mile trip across the sea, none of the journeys was like this one. Because as we heard earlier, a big storm whipped up. As we read in verse 37, a furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Imagine if you were one of the disciples. I wonder how you might have felt in that storm. If you were one of the disciples, as you set off, you would have been able to look up into the big blue sky. Now, as you looked up, all you would have seen were big, thick, grey clouds. As you set off as one of the disciples, you might have felt the warmth of the setting sun over the mountains on your skin. But now out in the middle of the sea, all you would have felt was the chill of the whipping wind and the spray of the sea waves. This ordinary sea journey soon became quite desperate. Because Mark, in fact, tells us, verse 38, these disciples thought they were going to die. This ordinary sea journey soon became desperate. That's the disciples. But did you notice where Jesus is at this point in this true story? Because you see, whilst the disciples, these professional fishermen, were battling against the storm, trying to keep the boat afloat, well, Jesus, he was asleep. Did you see that? Whilst the disciples were trying to stop the sail from tearing, the mast from breaking, Jesus is in the back of the boat asleep on a cushion. But Jesus' snooze didn't last for long. Because as soon as the disciples were caught in this storm, struggling to keep the boat afloat, worried that they were going to die, well, they woke Jesus up and they told him off, verse 38, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" I'm sure you can imagine what must have been going through the disciples' head. Jesus, don't you care that we're going to drown? We're professional fishermen. This storm is really serious. Trust us. Maybe they even thought he was being a bit lazy. Come on, Jesus, lend us a hand. The disciples, scared for their life, wake Jesus up and tell him off. But did you see what happens next? Woken by the disciples, told off by the disciples, Jesus sits up and looks out into the storm and says, "Quiet, be still." And instantly, there was still. Wow. Where there was chaos, now there was calm. Where there was danger, now there was safety. Where there was whipping winds and crashing waves, there was peace. All was still. All was calm. In fact, Mark says it was completely calm. This is an amazing story. I don't know about you, but as I read it, it gets me to ask myself a question. Who is this man? That's the question I ask when I read this true story. Who is this man? In fact, did you notice it's the question that the disciples ask right at the end of the passage? It's the question that Mark wants us to ask. Who is this man who is so calm in the face of such danger? Who is this man who even the wind and the waves obey him? Who is this man who even in the most desperate situation is powerful to save? Who is this man? Well, although it's the question the disciples ask, and it's the question that Mark wants us to ask, it's a question Mark has already answered. Do you remember? Mark chapter 1, verse 1. This is the beginning of the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. This is the good news about Jesus, God's King. That's who Jesus is. Who is this man? That's the question the disciples ask at the end of this passage. That's the question which Mark is getting us to ask. And as we've been looking at this true story this morning, we have seen that Jesus, God's King, well, he rules over even the wind and the waves. But here's the thing. If we carried on reading through Mark's account this morning, we would see that it's not just the wind and the waves that Jesus is powerful over. No, if we carried on reading through chapter 5, we would see that Jesus is powerful over demons as he casts out an evil spirit from a possessed man. We would see that Jesus is powerful over disease as he heals a woman who has been bleeding for 12 years. We would see that Jesus is powerful over even death as he raises to life a young girl. Whether it's drowning, whether it's demons, whether it's disease or even death, in desperate situations, Jesus is powerful to save. But if you only take away one thing from this morning, let it be this. Jesus' power over drowning and demons and disease and death, well, it all points to something even greater. Did you know that? Later in Mark's gospel, Mark tells us of how Jesus taught his disciples 3 times about why he came. 3 times Jesus tells his disciples about why he came. God made man. Why he did all of this saving from drowning. Why he did all of this saving from demons and disease and death. And in Mark chapter 10, verse 32, he says this. They were on their way up to Jerusalem with Jesus leading the way, and the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. All of this saving from drowning, from demons, disease, and death. Well, the reason Jesus came was to die. And you might be sat there at home this morning and asking yourself, why? Well, Jesus says a few verses later, in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, for even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, as the disciples were in the boat, as the wind was whipping, as the waves were crashing, the disciples' greatest need was not that they were drowning. Did you know that? As the disciples were trying to keep the sail from ripping and the mast from snapping, the disciples' greatest need was not that they were drowning. Now, Jesus tells us here that the disciples' greatest need, like you and I, is that they had a broken relationship with God. Like me and you, they had dishonored God. They had dishonored their heavenly Father. And that brought shame. That brought a price which had to be paid, a price which they could not pay. And so Jesus came and gave his life so that they wouldn't receive shame, but life. They would not experience death, but eternal life, a life with Jesus forever and ever. Is that how you view Jesus? I've got to ask you that question this morning. As you read of Jesus in this true story, is that the kind of Jesus you believe in? Because I don't know about you, but I think often we can think of Jesus a bit like Peppa Pig. He's maybe a fun guy. We can have a happy relationship with him. That's it. Maybe we think of Jesus like Captain Barnacles. Sure, he's really powerful, but he's not really powerful towards us. Maybe we even think of Jesus a bit like Marcus Rashford. Very talented, a nice guy at heart, but he doesn't really have any impact on my life. But do you see, that's not how the disciples think of Jesus. They don't think of Jesus like you and I might think of Peppa Pig or Captain Barnacles or even Marcus Rashford. Now, do you see how the disciples respond to Jesus at the end of this true story this morning? They respond to Jesus with fear. Did you see that? Verse 41. They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This is after Jesus calms the storm, not before. They were petrified before, but now they're fearful after. Jesus replaces the disciples' fear of drowning with a fear of him. Could Jesus be doing that to you this morning? As I finish, let me ask you this. What is it that you're most scared of in life? As human beings, we're small people, we're pretty powerless. We certainly feel that at a time like this. What are you most scared of? Maybe for you, what you're most scared of is the dark. When the lights are on, you're all good. But when the lights get switched off at night, well, you start getting really scared. And your mind starts racing as to what might be lying under your bed. Well, if that's you, you need to know this. If you're trusting in Jesus, you have no need to be scared. Because like Jesus was powerful over the wind and the waves, Jesus is more powerful than the scariest thing that you can imagine lying under your bed at night. And so as we trust in Jesus, as we look to Jesus, as we fear Jesus, he takes away our fear of the dark. So maybe tonight, as the lights go off and you find yourself a bit scared, pray to Jesus, because if we're trusting in him, he'll protect us through the night. Maybe for you, it's not dark, but it's desertion. It's being deserted. Maybe as you're left to sleep in your bed on your own at night, but maybe it's being left out by friends. Maybe it's others, your loved ones, dying before you. Maybe what you're most scared of in life is being left alone. But if that's you, know this. If you're trusting in Jesus, you have no need to fear. Because the disciples, they had no need to fear because Jesus was with them. That was the reason that they got to the other side of the storm, was because of who they were traveling with. And if we're trusting in Jesus, the power of Jesus is now present in our hearts. And so we need not fear ever being alone, because the presence of Jesus is with us. So the next time you find your mind being fearful of being left alone, look to Jesus. Trust in him. Fear him, because his presence dwells within you. Thirdly, finally, maybe it's not the dark. Maybe it's not being deserted. Maybe it's actually death. That's the thing that really keeps you up at night. It's the thing that the disciples were most scared of. That was why they woke Jesus up. Teacher, don't you care if we drown? Deep down, if we look hard enough, we all have fears about death. If you meet someone who says they're not scared of dying, they're just distracting themselves with other things. We all have that feeling deep down inside of us, gnawing away in us. But if we're trusting in Jesus, we have no need to fear. Because as we look to Jesus, as we trust in Jesus, as we fear Jesus, well, we see that he has conquered even death itself. So maybe the next time you find yourself worrying about your health, maybe the next time you worry about the loss of others, maybe even your own death one day, look to Jesus, the one who gave his own life for us so that we might be with Jesus forever and ever. As we look to Jesus, we see that Jesus gets us through death, even when it comes to that. In the most desperate situation, Jesus is most powerful to save.